Hello and welcome, lads and lasses, to another Mech Warrior lore video. Today we'll be talking about Mech Warriors, the fearsome men and women piloting behemoth war machines that are capable of leveling entire cities, with their awesome payloads. One thing to make mention of before we start is that we will not be discussing Clanner or Comstar Mech Warriors, being that they are a little bit more complex in how they work versus the traditional Mech Warrior to the Great Houses or, say, the Bandit Kingdoms. We will go over them at a later date in greater detail when we discuss Comstar's legions and the technologically superior hordes of the clans. Now, Mech Warriors are unsurprisingly the guys piloting mechs. They can be found in virtually every corner of known space. While most serve in the great legions of the main inner sphere houses, they also serve the periphery realms and are also reputable mercenaries, some being entire mercenary armies or just an individual freelancer. Mech warriors can, in some cases, be princes or princesses, or as lowly as pirates, and even on Solaris, they can be gladiators fighting for honor, glory, and money. Also, pilots of agriculture mechs or industrial mechs are not considered mech warriors. These are obviously farm warriors, okay, guys? Now, how did the Mech Warriors come to be, you ask? Well, you see, using the technological gains of Dr. Atlas with making breakthroughs in myomer fiber. For those who are unaware, myomer fiber is essentially the synthetic muscle that would make mech technology a viable industrial tech. The Terran hegemony would look to militarize mech technology in the 25th century, eventually succeeding in deploying the first mechs against the Draconis Combine. These deadly new war machines would be piloted by men and women who would become known as Mech Warriors, using the Peerless system of merits created by Ian Cameron. It would be only a few generations until Mech Warriors would develop into its own social class, as many who were born in the sphere would inherit their parents' mechs, and ergo be adopted into the many house legions. A little bit of a refresher. The Cameron Peer List, it is essentially basing all of your achievements and accomplishments as a sort of resume badge, or Medal of Honor, if you will, a sort of record of your accomplishments. This would help to promote honor and dignity, as well as reward those who performed admirably in any field, be it military or otherwise, really. This made it increasingly easy for children of these high-ranking personnel to attain power, as the merits would be inherited. This also goes for any dishonorable acts as well, to sort of instill a high expectation on the successors. It obviously didn't work out so well in the long run in the case of House Cameron, Rip Richard. But with the death of democracy and at the end of the Terran Alliance and the great families amassing tons of power and the fetishization of nobility among the masses across the sphere, made this system extraordinarily easy to adopt, as everyone sort of embraced it with open arms. This would lead to things such as inheriting positions, such as my father was a blacksmith, so I'll grow up to be a blacksmith too. Or in the case of the great houses, my father was the ruler of the Free Worlds League, and I'll be the next in line, so I'll rule it as well. Now, with the introduction of mechs and the rise of the Star League, allowed for House Cameron to own most of the mechs that were out and about throughout known space. However, as time would go on, the social classes of the Mech Warrior would evolve. Initially, the Mech Warrior was a sort of reminiscent of early 19th century biplane fighters in World War I, near celebrity status. In fact, in most cases, celebrity status for sure. However, they still retained a very modern demeanor. They didn't quite match the depictions of knights, but they were looked up to as heroes. However, after the Ameris Civil War in the late 27th century, and with the collapse of the Star League, Mech Warriors would own their mechs. The great houses would sponsor these great legions who would fight for them. They would also be made up of soldiers, tank jockeys, aerospace fighters, and more, of course, not just the Mech Warriors. Regardless, they were considered the cream of the crop, the elite and most prestigious in any house legion. The houses and any power who could hire them promised offers of land, fiefdoms, honor, and glory, and let's not forget sea bells and, of course, a title here and there. These Mech Warriors I will name Succession War era warriors. These mech warriors would resemble those of knights in the dark and middle ages of our history, greatly mirroring each other. Now, it is also important to note that the ranking of a warrior would differ slightly from house to house. For instance, Draconis warriors would resemble more of a samurai structure, or Federated Sons more akin to knights of feudal Europe. After the Fourth Succession War, this culture would greatly evolve. However, for the sake of this video, we're going to contain it to where the canon of the new games are set, which is post-Third War Succession era. So around 3015 to 3025, which is before the Fourth Succession War, which is just on the horizon. One thing I do want to make mention of is that post-Fourth Succession War, many of the great houses would begin to own these mechs. As newer technologies were produced, it left the old inheriting mechs to the wayside, as the newer models not only were superior to the previous models, but with the rediscovery of the Helm Memory Core, they had new technologies, new methods of production, and the out-of-date models just fell behind. They didn't have the weapons, equipment, or, for that matter, the parts to maintain them. For the equipment, well, before we start that, all of these technologies post-Star League era will degrade over time, and thusly, in some cases, be unable to perform at their intended capabilities, or, in some instances without the technical knowledge and limited supply, would eventually run out, and become what is known as lost tech, or lost technology. Essentially, things forgotten through the passages of time and war. Now, more notable things that became lost tech, for example, were things like the jump ships, the warships, or the HPG hubs in which the inner sphere uses to communicate. Even terraforming technology would become lost technology. Things such as cures for cancer or various ailments would also become an issue, as those medical technologies, along with agriculture and industrial, would become lost tech as well. And in some cases, if anyone's read the Kerensky, or the Blood of the Kerensky trilogy, one of the characters, I believe the son of the ruling Merrick, actually suffered from cancer, and one of the reasons why he helped the Sphere fight the clans was because he needed a cure for his son, and the only way to do that was through the New Avalon Institute, which is located in the Federated Sun. So he had to basically have his factories begin supporting their war efforts to get a cure for his son. Now, a lot of the key personnel during the Succession Wars as well, along with information regarding these technologies, would be forgotten and destroyed. And bearing in mind that these 4 or so Succession Wars, most notably the first, second, and the third, is where, the culmination of about 400-ish years would lead to the lost technology. It was essentially, these houses were so focused on this one thing, this attaining the rulership of the Star League, or the idea of it, the title of First Lordship, which is, the leader of the Star League, becoming the dominant house, like the Camerons had with the Terran hegemony. The issue is none of them could actually ascertain it, and as the wars drug on, they kept investing more effort, because every single one of these succession wars, all 4 of them, it felt like, for a lot of these houses, and in some cases, like the Draconis Combine against the Federated Sons early on, like they almost had them, and then something happened, they got attacked on a different front with the Lyran Commonwealth, and they had to pull their troops back, and then alliances would constantly shift between the houses. You'd have this constant backstabbery, like, the Lyran Commonwealth, the Federated Sun, have a sort of uneasy-ish alliance because they're diagonally to each other, and they normally fuck with the Draconis Combine, but then the Capellan Confederation and the Free Worlds League will join in on the Draconis side because, they're opposed to that, so they're like, okay, we can pick away at them there. Then you'll have things like the Taurian Concordat, nipping at the heel of the Federated Sons, or the Magistracy of Canopus, mildly fucking with everyone in the Rimward periphery. These sorts of minor little political things will play out in this universe, and not to dilly-dally too much, but it becomes such a clusterstorm. I can't really stress how bad the situation gets in this lower video. When we go into the Succession Wars, you'll get a little bit of a more in-depth look as to why, and more specific reasons as how bad it was. But to give a sort of more in-depth reason, imagine World War II if it just went on for 4 centuries, and it instead of like technical advances, you had you know, the technology that they had, they would sort of switch to the cheaper production. And in the case of the United States, they would produce things like the Sherman tank. And even though we technically could make better tanks in the United States towards the later ends of the war, it was easier to keep the production line going for the Sherman versus instituting a new technology. And so what happened is every house sort of got this mindset that numbers was everything. Manpower was one of the biggest resources they had. And so they flooded the enemy with manpower because they'd nuke worlds, they'd chemically gas them, and that was kind of where they were at. And so technology fell to the wayside, and also a lot of the apparatus for this technology was within the Terran hegemony, which was destroyed during the American Civil War. So that, again, I can't stress how much that becomes an issue with technology, because the Terran hegemony would lend lease things to them, like using automated factories and things, and they would set up the terraforming platforms, they would set up the underwater biodomes in the oceanic worlds. And so those underwater biodomes can't be rebuilt, and those cities are relying on technology that's 4 centuries old, and they're trying to repair it the best they can. The only reason why the HPG network works so well is because, well, the Comstar guys are, the basic apparatus of the Star League for communications. They just became Comstar, and houses agreed to not really fuck with them because without Comstar, they'd lose the HPG network, and, without that, then it would be back to the Age of War, and the Age of War was when they had to use jump ships to ferry information back and forth. This is where the universe gets convoluted, or not convoluted, well, yes, a little bit of convoluted stuff happens here, but it also gets very complicated and very heavy. And so when we talk about the equipment, the reason why I stress this is because it's important to know that these pieces of equipment don't do so well over the centuries, lacking technology, or they lose micro technology. So in the case of like some things, they'll become bigger. For one thing, neural helmets in terms of equipment. This is an extremely important piece for the Mech Warrior. Back on topic here. The neural helmet allows the wearer to wear the helmet, which basically syncs you up with the mech. All sorts of basic things like the balance of the mech, its uprightness. You can take punching actions, kicking actions, and you have a sort of sense of uprightness. The basic computer onboard system is capable of keeping the mech upright, but for more difficult maneuvers like punching, kicking, shoving, lunging, or just jumping on things, the computer can't quite handle that because it's got other priorities set. That it's also trying to keep tabs of. So it uses the human brain to sort of handle that. It also is a great way for the AI to bare bones AI to sort of, see how the pilot's doing. So if the pilot doesn't do well, in some cases, will automatically eject the pilot away from danger. Even though the saying is, flesh is cheap and metal is not, these systems were designed back in the Starleague era where pilots were actually a little bit more valuable than the metal because they had the ability to replace these mechs. Later on in the Four Succession Wars, this mentality would change, along with a few other things, but the rudimentary systems were in place. And besides, if you're going to lose a mech because the pilot's unconscious or his arms are broken, you might as well just eject him, because you'll lose a pilot, which is a very well-trained warrior, and a mech at the same time, so it's like double losses. If you can salvage something, it's better to salvage the pilot at the very least. But the neural helmets, as technology, like we'd mentioned before, would degrade. So originally, they kind of looked like fighter pilot helmets, sort of like what you see in HBS's Battletech or the Mech Warrior Online series, which, by the way, they do a horrendous job of maintaining the canon when it comes to what the helmet should look like, because as time went on, the technology started to wear out. And as it wore out, they had to replicate new helmets, and the newer helmets got bulkier and bulkier, and so much to the point that most pilots can't actually rotate their head. In fact, the helmet apparatus that sits on their shoulders pretty much locks your head almost in place. Instead, inside the helmet is a series of display screens. These display screens allow you to view the rear view camera and various other instruments inside the mech, but you have lost that maneuverability at this point. They still do a decent job of reading your brain, but there's other issues like cracking into them becomes a problem. One such issue is you can run a magnet along the edge of, I think, the inside of the lining of some of the helmets and older models of the helmets as well. And a magnet will disrupt the brainwave scanner thing, which basically tells, it's like the keys, if you will. Your brain is synced to the helmet and it's synced to the mech. Each pilot is, every time they're introduced to a mech. They're synced up to it, so to speak. And what happens is, if somebody tries to hijack it, they can run a magnet along the inside to prevent the security system from either A, shutting it down, not booting up, B, melting their brain, or C, or they're a little bit less lucky, I guess it would give them some minor brain damage. Actually, that might be the more lucky one. The melting brain part's probably the worst one. But besides that, there's a couple other ways, like a code breaker, which basically it simulates like 100 or 1,000 or so neural waves until one sort of syncs. So you don't put it on your head, obviously, until it does that. And what that does is create a lag in the system, so that by the time the boot up protocol initiates, it will just immediately bypass the security function. One of the flaws or quirks with the technology, because it was never really quite foolproof. Now, these technologies would be improved later on, and neural helmets would become better again. More notable is the neural helmets and the in the hands of the Star League, or not, excuse me, Star League, they're dead. Comstar, they have some pretty advanced helmets, or in the case of the Clanners, they will have helmets that look like your traditional, like, pilot helmet. It's smaller and condensed technology. They didn't lose that sort of technology. The Clanners did lose technology, but they lost a lot less, especially when it came to warfare, because their whole civil war, when they went on their exodus, didn't last nearly as long as the Succession Wars, because the Succession Wars were happening while the clans returned. But the next very important piece of equipment is a cooling suit. Now, in the mechs heat up a lot, like a metric shit ton. They can get so hot that in some extreme cases, the pilot can actually ignite on fire. Now, most times it doesn't happen. What normally happens is they die from heat stroke, or they will just pass out. In which case, the mech will, depending on how well the onboard AI works and what it's set to, will just eject the pilot. The cooling vests, or the cooling suits, were very flexible, full body equipment. Basically, you put it on your body and it keeps you cool. It has advanced, technology, so it's not super cumbersome. In fact, it's relatively comfortable, and it pretty much fits your body really nicely. Now, the problem is, as time went on, these suits, for whatever reason, fell out of production, because Star League, or aka the Terran hegemony, had a monopoly on the production of them. And so, as they lost that technology when they collapsed, these suits eventually disappeared. After the first Succession War, there was a fair bit, but after the second one, they were rapidly disappearing. And by the third one, they were almost all gone. Now, what they were replaced by were called cooling vests. Cooling vests are just sort of like a flak jacket, and quite literally, in the sense that some cooling vests are embedded with bits of armor to prevent small arms fire should the pilot have to eject and get caught out in the open. And it just covers your body. It works almost as effectively. It's not as comfy or as effective, and it only covers your torso because it's a bulky system and how it works. Now, one of the issues with this bulkier vest is you have to keep the body still cool. And one thing that the Piranha Games and HBS does completely wrong is the Mech Warriors at this point don't wear a lot of clothing, in the sense that they're trying to keep their body as cool as possible in these machines. So in a lot of cases, they'll wear, it's not really their underwear, but essentially underwear for the most part. Like, women will wear like a sports bra, panties. Guys will wear boxers or something of that equivalent, or Speedo if they're really freaky, Mech Warrior types of pirates, baby. Ugh, disgusting. But, it heats up in there really fast. Even with the cooling vest and even with the internal cooling system, can't keep up, because they're basically sitting on a fusion reactor, only a few feet above it. And as the heat from the myomer fiber and the weapons and the other various parts of the mech begin to heat up because they're encased in armor, they can't properly cool, even if they have tons of cooling vents. So it's going to get hot in there. The idea with wearing less clothing is, the body is allowed to get a little bit more air, and it's not insulated, so you won't cook as much. And it's essential that you do not wear clothing too much. Number one, because you could potentially catch on fire. And number two, which is, by the way, is much rarer than it sounds. And number two, so you don't pass out. That's the most important part. Pass out or die from heat stroke. That is the biggest issue. And it's a shame that the other BattleTech games or in the Mech Warrior games don't adhere to this canon. I mean, when cooling suits begin to get reintroduced, when the clans invade and with the discovery of the Helm Memory Core, a lot of this technology will actually slowly resurface. But from the beginning of these games, this stuff should be rare. It shouldn't be common at all, because they have kind of reached a very backward state. By the time the Fourth Succession War rolls around, they barely have any technology. I mean, they recently rediscovered the Helm Memory Core before the war, but that technology hasn't really quite reached production yet, because it's still slowly catching up. And the Helm Memory Core will help when the clans invade, and they'll catch up eventually. But not to dilly-dally too much on that. Other equipment can vary from the various houses. Some carry melee weapons. In the case of the filthy Draconis weebs, they've got katanas and all sorts of honorable weaponry. Mostly I'd honestly expect to carry laser pistol or a slug thrower pistol. Something pretty standard. Sidearm for self-protection, or, killing yourself because you don't want to be captured for whatever reason. They're really going to do terrible stuff to you. You never know. A lot of prisons, especially in the Draconis Combine, are borderline concentration camps, so, there's that. And the prisoner quality of life can vary from inner sphere power to inner sphere power. And in some cases, like the Marian hegemony, which are basically the Sprace Roma weeaboos, or Romaboos as they're called, towards the core word, who poke at the FWL along with the Majesty of Canopus, aka Catgirl people, they practice slavery. So, yeah, that's a problem. Now, there is some things that will change. And one thing I do want to make mention of, while I didn't want to dilly-dally too much, is that weaponry inside the cabins will change. And one thing I'm going to say now, it's not really something I want to dive into too much, but when the clans invade, you will see the armaments within a Mech Warriors capsule, or, what weapons they'll carry with them, will not be pistols. They'll be borderline rifles or rocket launchers. Borderline, obviously. Because clanners have these things called battle armor. These little power armored suits that are extremely powerful. They're all equipped with jetpacks, and they're capable of severing mechs' limbs by cutting them off and breaking into the cockpit and ripping out the pilot. It's not a pleasant way to go. Mech Warriors don't really like dealing with battle armor. They're kind of horrifying. Though it is kind of adorable when you see them riding around on the mechs when they're charging into battle. You can use that as armor, by the way. Literal armor. So when somebody shoots at you, like the little battle armor goes flying off, yeah, he's dead, but that technically deflected a blow, so, there's that. That's kind of adorable and kind of horrifying at the same time. But, I think that will kind of... well, actually, no. There's actually a lot more I want to talk about. Never mind. Fun fact, though. Aerospace fighter pilots, before we move on to the next subject, use helmets or neurohelmets as well. They use a similar thing. It's a more of a variant of it, really. But they actually use a neurohelmet to operate. Most other things don't use neurohelmets, like tank jockeys or infantrymen. They have varying types of helmets and heads-up display information, sort of similar to the Aliens Colonial Marines or Halo Marines. A lot of infantry will have helmets kind of like that with heads-up displays of great inner sphere powers. As you go to the various houses, they will have varying degrees of weaponry and things. Melee combat is common, and that has to do with the fact that production of weapons is actually kind of hard, and not to mention the whole honor thing. And that can vary from house to house. Traditionally, Draconis warriors will have a katana. More of a ritualistic thing, but they can and they do know how to use it. Free Worlds League, they got their own little swords. I meant to really say the Marian hegemony. They have their little fucking Romaboo gladiuses. Ugh. But that's one thing. Okay, so next topic. Training. Training of a Mech Warrior is actually very different. And we will go into more specifics when we get to the house books, which are called the source books for the houses, or the field manuals, if you will. And they specialize in each faction's military arms and how they function, because they all work extremely differently. So this is kind of a general overview video, as I said before. So for training, the general gist is we're going to break it down into a little couple things here. Mercenaries and nobles are trained kind of similarly. They're trained by family members as well as along with friends or colleagues, closely knit people. They're trained together because, most mercenaries actually grow into it and then quite a few, join in when they leave other things. In the terms of Solaris gladiators, there's these things called the stables, and basically, little wannabe mech warriors will go and train and become like sort of underlings of these gladiators, if you will. For pirates, it's really just, okay, did you live past 20 minutes? You're good, you know? For the Great Inner Sphere House armies, this one will be a little bit simpler. You have to apply for an academy, military academy. You get into the military academy to decide what you're going to do. You have to do the neural tests, have to check out for a bunch of other things. And if you check out with all the various things that you need, especially the neural one, because the neural syncing is actually a problem, especially with the degradation of technology. If you do pass that, though, you will then go to an extensive training academy, which specializes in training mech warriors, and you'll do that for a few years. For the first few years, you will spend your time in, they call them battle pods, which is sort of a neat nod towards the actual, like, fun thing that you can play at cons and stuff, where you play the actual mech warrior games in. But, the battle pods are for training, and most of your time will be spent doing battle sims and all sorts of things, simming this thing, because they're not going to want to put you into a mech just yet. They will have junk mechs, which they will start putting people into once after the first couple of years, and this can vary from house to house, by the way, or Barbarian Kingdoms. Barbarian Kingdoms kind of operate slightly similarly, copying the Great Houses. Then they will transfer you to the final stages of your training, in which you'll actually be put into mechs that are really kind of shoddy and not really well made, because they're kind of dummy mechs and they're meant to get you in the thing or the flow of the real thing. After you complete that, then you were assigned to a company or a lance, and then you are shipped off to wherever you're going to be it, whatever army. They'll break you up. So in some cases, like in the Draconis Combine, one of the Curitan's children was sent off to, I forget what the army was, but it's basically the periphery army. And it's considered dishonorable in their culture because he was kind of a naughty kid. And it's like, no, you're going to go out there and just guard the periphery from nothing. And it's like, oh, that's dishonorable. Like, that's where, in the Draconis Combine, a lot of mech warriors go if they're not looked at highly or they're not from high-standing noble families or have any sort of connections. The honorable will normally get the better positions because in Mech Warrior Society, you gain fiefdoms, lands, and titles, and women, or men, if you're a girl, if you are in positions along where you can gain, not notoriety, but recognition for your deeds in battle. And so being on borders with another great house brings great honor. In the case of the Federated Sons, being on a border with the Draconis Combine is very honorable, but, you still hate those Drac scum. Hashtag remember Kentaris for the massacre. And by the way, they massacre the shit out of each other, so don't worry about it. You can pick your great house and you can be like, this massacre right here. This in particular one. Fuck you. But that's kind of how that all works out. Now, there's more complicated things. So, Mech Warriors will begin at the base level, like a tiny level. In the case of each house is structured very differently, right? So the Free World, or not the Free World League, sorry. We'll use Lyran Commonwealth and the Federated Sons is more like a feudal Europe example. Lyran Commonwealth more close to Germany. Federated Sons more close to maybe England. And they kind of use that same medieval structure of errant knights and knights, and that's how they sort of move up the chain of command. In places like the Draconis Combine, it's very different. You have, the samurai, and they operate with the Bushido Code, or the Bushido Code. I'm very terrible with pronunciations today. And that is a huge, huge role. It also makes them extreme. That's also one of the Draconis Combine's weaknesses, is the Bushido Code, because it makes it slightly predictable for the Lyran Commonwealth troopers as well as the Federated Sun troopers. Kind of like, okay, we kind of understand the codes of conduct, and we can play that to advantage. For instance, if a commander fails, even Draconis play each other to advantage. So, if there's a very dishonorable thing, due to Bushido Code, that commanding officer will have to kill himself. And in the case of the Kentaris massacre in the First Succession War, not only did Mech Warriors commit seppuku, but hundreds, if not thousands, of Draconis soldiers did, because they didn't see the honor in killing children and old people. and they were killing them. And the only way they could make it stop, even the Draconis warrior, who is a very indoctrinated warrior in the Inner Sphere. In terms of the great houses, the Draconis warrior is the most indoctrinated warrior of all of them, in my opinion. But you could argue that the Blakis. But in the Inner Sphere, I'd normally say the Draconis in terms of great houses. And so the Draconis Mech Warrior is very, very strict with how they operate in protocol. And so they will take their own lives. In a lot of cases, those that didn't begin to aid the Federated Sun civilians and hiding them in caves and, rock formations from the execution squads that were going around just rounding up everyone, committing mass genocide, because, one of the commanding officers of the Curitan forces there was insulted. And so he had a bit of a tissy. And so he was like, I'm going to wipe you all out for insulting my honor. And even when that news got back home, their own propaganda apparatus couldn't quite spin that information in a positive light. Not to dilly-dally too much, but this gives an insight into how their honor code works. And this works for Federated Sun warriors as well. Now remember, much like feudal Europe in our universe, if you can get away with it and gain honor or more power or succeed or get victory, they will still do it. Just because there's these codes of honor just means it's another thing for people to maneuver through, because people are still bastards in this universe. In fact, arguably more so now that neo-feudalism's a thing. It is adorable when you have little princesses and princes prancing about all these noble things as they basically fucking slaughter thousands of people. All for a few solar systems. And, the promise of being the first lord, being ruler of all mankind and all that. Oh, it sounds so cool, doesn't it? Look, you get a cool little flag. It's got a little star on it. Wow, it's so special. Oh, they're a little bit retarded, though. But that point aside, this is the roughest overlay of Mech Warriors and what they are. Mech Warriors, by the way, another thing, they can learn how to pilot other mechs. And a lot of the mechs are actually designed very similarly. Thanks to the Neuro Helmet, it makes it extremely easy to tell where everything is. Now, this is one contradictory element because the Mech Warrior games, and when you see the internal cockpit, especially in the newer ones, they're very, very different cockpits inside these things. So, in some of the fluff, it says that these cockpits are actually, relatively standardized for the most part, so that a Mech Warrior can plunk into anyone and sort of have a general idea how to operate it. Now, there's still a lot of differentials. A catapult is a long LRM boat. It is an artillery mech. It has, either two PPCs or it can have, two LRM-20s or whatever the fuck it has, right? The pilot will still need to train for that. So the pilot will have specializations in certain mech fields or certain weight types, but even that, there's different, subcategories, like brawlers or laser boats or whatever, and they will specialize in these fields. Now, that doesn't mean they can't pilot the other mechs. In fact, they will often train as much as possible and with all their downtime. Training is a huge thing in a Mech Warrior's life, and training never ever stops for the proper Mech Warrior. Those battle pods, like I was talking about, they will be, I almost said playing, but technically playing with each other. That sounds weird and sexual, but that's not what I was going for, but that's where we're at now. They will play with each other in a non-sexual way, in a simulated combat-y way, and until they get good with these things. And they will, in the Sims, you can plunk in different mech chassis types, different loadouts, and then you can just, simulate a battle. You can simulate a historical battle, you can simulate, any scenario with lance mates or against your lance mates or whatever, or against other lance in your company, depending on how big your mercenary army is, or if you're in a house legion, you're probably going to be in the Sims a lot. And you'll spend a lot of time in the Sims. Because understanding, and the Mech Warrior knows this for the most part, good Mech Warriors, not pirates, or, periphery kingdoms, which can vary in their pilot quality. They will practice against the various types of mechs in the universe and just sort of get an idea of okay, so the dragon mech is just a pile of dog shit. Okay, well, that's pretty easy to deal with, Or if it's the king crab, right, that's kind of tough. That's got a lot of armor. How do we deal with this? As Lance will practice. One thing from another franchise, Star Wars. I really love Star Wars. Star Wars Republic Commandos specifically, though. In the intro of their trailer, they have like the Sims where they're doing a sim against a droid thing. Think of that, but in BattleTech, but with their mechs. They basically do the same thing for the most part. They can also simulate battles on their holo maps, and yes, they love their holo technology. I've never really liked that about any sci-fi universe. Just find holograms to be the least intuitive for whatever reason, but they're interesting. But they can simulate hologram battles, and stuff like that as well. If they want to, for the commanding officers of the higher mech warriors, I mean, they can see more tactical information, tactical readouts on how their lance is going to perform. But in terms of the battle pods for the more, basic training for mech warriors, they'll practice all that. They'll practice being in various other mech chassis, to get an understanding how they work. So your average mech warrior will technically in fluff be specialized towards a certain group of mechs or a certain mech in particular, but they will know how to operate various other mechs. And they will also know relatively some mechanical stuff about their mech, but sometimes they leave that to the mech techs, who are the engineers who, fiddle with that and the myomer and replacing parts and stuff like that. Now, in the case of the clanners, again, we're not going to talk about them too much, but the clanners is completely different. They're expected to not only train 24/7 pretty much, but they are also expected to know every piece of their mech by heart, and they're expected to perform maintenance on their own mechs. So a completely different sort of thing. And it varies from great house to great house, and it also varies from era to era. Things change. For instance, the Mech Warrior in the beginning, not to dilly-dally too much here, but in the beginning of the Terran hegemony, they were like, oh, we will be, we're basically like World War I fighter pilots. Ah, yes, we're super cool and stuff. Puts on cool sunshades. Wow, that fucking 90s thing that plays, and his little, like, fucking hairs flipping back or something. That's basically what they started out as. And then it was like, it reached a point where it's like, they're so cool thanks to the peerless system. They inherited these things, and then so the next generation came up, and it was like, okay, it's starting to form into a social class. It was a pretty prestigious thing, but it was actually after the collapse of the Star League, in my opinion. And it can vary because it's already kind of the same, but it's a little different on how it works, especially within the houses. Because after the collapse of the Star League, they were like, okay, now my dad was a warrior for the Free Worlds League, and I'll be a warrior too, and this is his mech, and I will, inherit it and ride it into battle. And that's essentially what started to happen as time went on. And it's like, look, I can still see a chunk of my dad's scalp. It's still glued to the fucking ceiling when he fucking got, his cockpit blew open from a friggin' AC-20, whatever. That sort of thing is something that they deal with. But all in all, that's kind of the general overlay of the Mech Warrior. Now, Mech Warriors, another thing, especially in the role-playing games, like the Mech Warrior roleplay or A Time of War, they are also expected to know basic combat. Again, to reiterate, their training is pretty advanced. They are supposed to be the elite infantry as well. I mean, they're not equipped that well, all things considered, because they are basically, you got a chick in a bikini, and she's like, oh, shit, like, if I get a little bit of shrapnel, I'm going to be fucking sad. But besides that, I think I'll get over it. But they're expected to know how to, fight in melee, because they need to understand it for their mechs, and they're also expected to know how to operate basic weapons. So you can have a mech warrior, who's caught out in like a bar fight, and, in a pistol duel or something. That kind of stuff happens. They're not just restricted to the mechs. It does kind of make me want to go back to one more thing, like an annoyance that I have with HBS and Mech Warrior. Not to soapbox too much, but excuse me while I hop up on there. It's something that bugs me. I don't know. Like the fact that it's just inconsistencies in the fluff. Because it's like, all right, so, they wear... The reason why they dress the way they do, the guys wear, the boxers, the Speedo thing, is because they don't want to fucking pass out. But you look at the Battletech art and you're like, that just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the universe. Yes, it looks kind of silly. And they even talk about it in the fluff. Like, yeah, no, these helmet things, they fucking suck. I can't move my head. I'm restricted to looking forward. God forbid if something hits the thing hard, I'm pretty sure my head will go off with it. And that's kind of the thing. It's supposed to feel jury-rigged because at that time point, the time point when the BattleTech HBS game takes place, and the time point when which MechWarrior 5, the new reboot's going to take place, this is a kind of thing that they deal with regularly. It's shitty. It's not a good situation. In a lot of circumstances, this is fucking awful. And it's meant to be that way. At this point, if they're going to reboot the franchise, they need to make it encapsulate the fluff, because I don't know. Adding in random factions and Mary Sue's and plot devices like the Argo, it's cute and all, but like, don't forget what made you an interesting universe. Your tribal, punkish, sort of like neo-feudalism, crazy stuff going off into space. And it's all sorts of bad shit. But besides that, I think that'll wrap up my Mechwarrior lore video. When we start delving into more of the factions, specifically the Star League lore we're working on still, when we get to their field manual, we will then begin to talk about the Star League Mech Warrior, and more specifically, their ranking, their hierarchy, what does it take to be a Mech Warrior in this specific society, and this will apply for all the houses, as well as the clans, as well as the Great Periphery Kingdoms, as well as, Comstar, and various other things. Well, pirates. Pirates can probably pretty much be surmised as, well, you didn't die, congratulations. I mean, there's various pirate outfits with varying degrees of competency, all being which slightly on the lower end of the spectrum. But either or. Thanks for watching, and I hope you guys enjoyed this lore video. Until next time, you guys have yourself a fantastic day.